The Iraqi Republican Guard's Medina division was supposed to be the ace in Saddam Hussein's deck. Not just any troops, the ideological elite, the guys who got the best equipment, the most training, the privilege of wearing those distinctive red berets that marked them as Iraq's finest. They'd fought Iran for 8 years and survived. They'd crushed Kurdish uprisings. They genuinely believed they were a match for any army on earth. Saddam had positioned them for exactly this moment. While coalition forces steamrolled through the regular Iraqi army's conscripts in Kuwait during late February 1991, the Republican Guard armored division sat in reserve across southern Iraq, waiting for the real fight. The plan was simple and, honestly, not terrible on paper. Let the Americans exhaust themselves bulldozing through cannon fodder, then hit them with the Republican Guard in a decisive armored battle that would bog down the whole offensive and force negotiations. The Medina division was the linchpin. Positioned northwest of Basra, they controlled the approaches to the Highway 8 corridor, the main escape route for Iraqi forces fleeing Kuwait. Intelligence estimates put them at around 300 tanks, mostly T-72s, plus armored personnel carriers and artillery. These weren't the export model T-72s that regular Army units got. These were supposed to be the good ones. I say supposed to be, because Iraqi tank crews had no idea what they were actually up against. February 27, 1991, Day 4 of the Ground War. The 1st Armored Division, nicknamed Old Ironsides, had been driving north through Iraq for 3 days, covering ground faster than anyone expected. Their mission was to swing wide around Kuwait, cut off the Republican Guard's escape routes, and destroy Iraq's best units in open battle. The Americans brought 348 M1A1 Abrams tanks to this fight. Not the original M1 from the early 1980s, the M1A1 with the 120mm smoothbore gun, and most critically, thermal imaging sights that could see through darkness, smoke, and sandstorms. Every single American tank had this technology. Every single one. The Iraqis had conventional optical sights. You know, the kind that require you to actually see the target with your eyeballs. On paper, this looked like a fair fight. 2 armored forces of comparable size meeting in open desert. The Medina division even had defensive positions picked out, good terrain, fields of fire planned. They'd done their homework. But homework doesn't matter when your opponent is taking a completely different test. Around mid-afternoon on the 27th, a massive sandstorm rolled across southern Iraq. Visibility dropped to maybe 200 meters if you were lucky. For tankers using optical sights, this was a nightmare. You couldn't see anything. The battle would have to wait until the weather cleared, except it wouldn't. Because while Iraqi tank commanders sat buttoned up in their T-72s waiting for the sandstorm to pass, American thermal sights cut through the blowing sand like it wasn't even there. Iraqi tanks showed up as bright white shapes on black screens, clear as day, from 2,500 meters out. The Medina division was about to learn a lesson that Soviet tank doctrine had never prepared them for. Modern war isn't about bravery or training or even numbers. It's about technology. And the Americans had brought technology to Medina Ridge that made the entire concept of fair fight obsolete. They were about to be obliterated by an enemy they couldn't see. The Republican Guard wasn't just propaganda. They actually had a real combat record. During the Iran-Iraq War from 1980 to 1988, these guys had seen serious fighting. Not the quick, overwhelming victories that Desert Storm would become. Grinding, brutal warfare with human wave attacks and chemical weapons in battles that lasted weeks over single cities. The Republican Guard divisions had been there for the worst of it and come out intact. That experience created genuine confidence. When you've survived 8 years fighting Iran's Revolutionary Guards, you start believing you're pretty damn good at your job. The Medina division had participated in major offensives. They'd held defensive lines against Iranian armor. They knew how to fight. Saddam's regime fed that confidence with everything they had. Republican Guard soldiers got better pay, better food, better living conditions. Their families received privileges. They were constantly told they were Iraq's finest warriors, the sword of the Ba'ath Party, the guardians of the revolution. State television ran footage of their parades, their exercises, their equipment. Baghdad radio announced their invincibility. The international media bought into it too. Throughout late 1990 and early 1991, Western news outlets treated the Republican Guard as this formidable force that would be the real test of coalition military power. Analysts on CNN and BBC talked about them like they were the Waffen-SS or something. Elite, fanatical, extremely dangerous. Military experts predicted high coalition casualties when the ground war reached the Republican Guard positions. Here's what nobody was saying out loud. The Republican Guard had never fought a modern Western military. Iran didn't have thermal sights. Iran didn't have satellite reconnaissance. Iran didn't have GPS navigation or laser rangefinders or any of the technological advantages that American forces considered standard equipment by 1991. The Iran-Iraq War had been fought with 1960s and 1970s technology on both sides. Lots of courage, lots of casualties, but fundamentally a war that could have happened in 1973 and looked the same. I don't know if Saddam actually believed his own propaganda or if he was just committed to the bit at that point. Hard to tell with dictators, but Iraqi commanders clearly believed it. They thought their T-72s were competitive with American tanks. They thought their training was adequate. They thought defensive positions and numerical parity would be enough. The T-72 itself contributed to this delusion. It looked impressive. Low profile, 125mm gun, decent armor protection by 1970s standards. Soviet export propaganda had marketed it as a world-class main battle tank. Several countries operated them. They'd performed adequately in Middle Eastern conflicts where nobody had overwhelming technological advantages. But here's the thing about tank warfare that the Iraqis didn't grasp. It's not about who has the bigger gun or thicker armor anymore. It's about who sees the enemy first. Fire control systems, rangefinders, stabilization, targeting computers, thermal imaging, that's what determines modern tank battles. The side that can accurately engage targets at 2,500 meters wins against the side that can't see past 1,000 meters, every single time. The Medina division rolled into their defensive positions near Medina Ridge, fully expecting to give the Americans a bloody nose. They had no idea they were about to be in the most one-sided tank battle in modern warfare. The 1st Armored Division had been in Saudi Arabia since November 1990. 3 months of sitting in the desert, training, waiting, wondering if this whole thing would kick off, or if diplomacy would somehow prevent the war everyone knew was coming. By late February, they were ready to get it over with. Old Ironsides wasn't some newly formed unit thrown together for Desert Storm. This was a division with lineage going back to 1940, veterans of North Africa and the drive across Europe in World War II. In 1991, they were based in Germany as part of the force meant to stop Soviet tanks if the Cold War ever went hot. That meant they'd spent decades preparing for mechanized warfare against a Soviet-style enemy, which is exactly what the Iraqi Republican Guard was, a Soviet-style force with Soviet equipment and Soviet doctrine. The division brought 348 M1A1 Abrams tanks to Iraq. Not scattered across multiple units, concentrated, ready to hit hard. Each tank weighed 63 tons, powered by a 1,500 horsepower gas turbine engine that could push it to 42 miles per hour across desert terrain. The 120mm smoothbore gun could penetrate any armor the Iraqis had, from ranges the Iraqis couldn't even shoot back from. But the gun wasn't the real advantage. The thermal imaging sight was. Every single Abrams in the 1st Armored Division had the AN/VSG-2 tank thermal sight. This wasn't experimental technology. This was proven, reliable equipment that had been in service since the mid-1980s. It worked by detecting infrared radiation, heat signatures from targets. A tank engine puts out a lot of heat. So do the tracks, the exhaust, the turret after it's been sitting in the sun. In complete darkness, or through smoke or sandstorms, thermal sights could spot enemy armor from over 2,000 meters away. The Iraqis had nothing comparable. Their T-72s used optical sights and basic infrared searchlights for night fighting. You know what infrared searchlights do? They basically announce your position to anyone with thermal imaging while barely improving your own ability to see. It's like bringing a flashlight to a gunfight against someone with night vision goggles. Or American tank crews had been training with this equipment for years. They knew exactly what advantages it gave them. They'd run exercises in Germany simulating combat against Soviet tanks in poor visibility. The doctrine was simple. Use your thermal sight advantage to engage first, engage accurately, and destroy the enemy before they can return effective fire. I sometimes wonder if Iraqi intelligence had any idea what they were up against. Probably not. The Soviets didn't export their best equipment to client states. The T-72s Iraq had were downgraded versions without the composite armor or the advanced fire control systems that Soviet forces used. And even Soviet tanks didn't have thermal sights as good as American ones in 1991. On February 24th, the ground war kicked off. The 1st Armored Division pushed north through the Iraqi desert with 7th Corps, part of the massive left hook that would cut off Iraqi forces in Kuwait. They covered 140 miles in 3 days, moving faster than intelligence estimates said they could, destroying scattered Iraqi units that got in the way. By February 27th, they'd reached the approaches to Medina Ridge. Intelligence reported heavy Republican Guard presence ahead. The Medina Division dug in, waiting. The division's 2nd Brigade would hit them first. 116 Abrams tanks moving through a sandstorm that reduced visibility to almost nothing. For anyone with optical sights, that is. February 27th, 1991. Around 3:30 in the afternoon, the 2nd Brigade of the 1st Armored Division was pushing north when their lead scouts spotted something through the blowing sand. Iraqi positions. Lots of them. The sandstorm had been building all day. By mid-afternoon, visibility was maybe 200 meters with the naked eye, and that's being generous. Wind was whipping sand and dust across the desert hard enough that you could barely see the tank in front of you in formation. Weather like this would normally halt military operations completely. You can't fight what you can't see, but the Americans could see just fine. Through their thermal sights, Iraqi positions showed up clear as day. T-72 tanks dug into defensive positions. Armored personnel carriers spread out in supporting positions. Artillery pieces, trucks, infantry fighting positions. The entire defensive layout of the Medina Division's forward elements was visible on those green-black thermal screens like someone had drawn them a map. The Iraqis had no idea the Americans were there. None. Their optical sights were useless in the sandstorm. They were sitting blind, waiting for the weather to clear so they could actually see to fight. Standard doctrine for any military using conventional optics: you wait out bad weather. You don't charge into battle when you can't see your hand in front of your face. Except the other guy could see perfectly and was already lining up shots. The 2nd Brigade commander made the call to attack. Why wouldn't he? His tanks could engage enemy armor from 2,500 meters through the sandstorm. The Iraqis couldn't see past 200 meters, even if they were looking in the right direction. This wasn't a battle. This was a shooting gallery. American tank commanders started identifying targets through their thermal sights. Target acquisition was almost too easy. Every Iraqi vehicle showed up as a bright heat signature against the cooler background. Tank engines, even idling ones, put out enormous amounts of heat. You could count the individual T-72s, pick your target, range it with the laser rangefinder, and put a sabot round through it before the crew inside even knew you existed. I've always thought there's something uniquely terrifying about being killed by something you never see. At least in a fair fight, you know what's happening. You can shoot back. You have a chance. The Iraqis at Medina Ridge had no chance because they literally could not perceive the threat until rounds started slamming into their tanks. The first shots went out around 3:45 p.m. M829 sabot rounds, depleted uranium penetrators traveling at over 5,000 feet per second. At 2,500 meters, they punched through T-72 frontal armor like it was tin foil. Iraqi tanks started exploding before their crews could react. Some Iraqi tanks tried to return fire. They were shooting blind, aiming at muzzle flashes they could barely see through the sandstorm, hoping to hit something. Their 125mm guns had the range to reach American positions in theory. In practice, they had no idea where American tanks actually were. No laser rangefinders, no thermal targeting, just guessing and hoping. American gunners weren't guessing. Every shot was precisely ranged, accurately aimed, fired from a stabilized gun platform that could shoot accurately while moving. The M1A1's fire control computer did the ballistic calculations automatically. Point at target, laser range. Computer adjusts for distance and movement. Pull trigger, hit target. It was methodical, professional, brutally efficient. From the Iraqi perspective, the world just started exploding around them without warning. 1 second, you're sitting in your T-72, buttoned up against the sandstorm, waiting for the weather to clear so you can actually see to fight. The next second, the tank next to yours erupts in a fireball. Then another one 50 meters away detonates. Then yours takes a hit and you're dead before you understand what's happening. The surviving Iraqi crews had no idea where the fire was coming from. Through the sandstorm, they couldn't see muzzle flashes. They couldn't see American tanks. They couldn't see anything except sand and smoke and their own vehicles burning. Some crews tried to traverse their turrets to shoot back. But shoot back at what? Where? They were fighting ghosts. American sabot rounds hitting T-72s at 2,500 meters produced catastrophic kills most of the time. The M829 depleted uranium penetrator would punch through the frontal armor, usually right through the turret ring or the glacis plate, then fragment inside the crew compartment. T-72S stored ammunition in the turret carousel, right where the penetrator was entering. When that ammo cooked off, the entire turret would blow off the hull and flip 20 feet into the air. The Abrams crews could watch this happen through their thermal sights in real time. Shoot, watch the hit, watch the secondary explosion, watch the turret flip, move to next target. Some gunners were engaging and destroying multiple Iraqi tanks before the first one had even stopped burning. This wasn't a battle in any traditional sense. Battles require both sides to fight. The Iraqis couldn't fight back effectively because they couldn't see what they were fighting. They were being systematically executed by an enemy that might as well have been invisible. Iraqi commanders tried to organize a response. Some units attempted to withdraw. Some tried to advance toward where they thought the Americans might be, hoping to close the range enough to actually see their targets. Neither tactic worked. American thermal sights tracked every movement. Any Iraqi tank that moved just made itself an easier target. The 2nd Brigade was advancing while firing. The M1A1 stabilization system meant they could shoot accurately at 20 miles per hour across rough terrain. Iraqi T-72s had basic stabilization, but nowhere near American standards. Even if they could see targets, engaging accurately while moving was nearly impossible for them. Temperature differential is what made thermal sights so effective. The colder the ambient temperature, the easier it is to spot hot objects. February in the Iraqi desert gets cold at night, but even during the afternoon, tank engines and recently fired guns showed up clearly against the background. The sandstorm actually helped the Americans by cooling everything down except the targets they needed to see. I don't think anyone in the Medina division understood what was killing them until it was over. How could they? Their entire experience with tank warfare was based on being able to see the enemy. That's how war had always worked. You see the other guy, he sees you. Whoever shoots better wins. This was something completely outside their frame of reference. Death from an enemy they couldn't perceive. By 5 p.m., less than 90 minutes after first contact, the 2nd Brigade had destroyed over 60 Iraqi tanks. They hadn't lost a single Abrams. The final count from the 2nd Brigade's initial assault was obscene. 61 Iraqi tanks destroyed, 34 armored personnel carriers, 8 air defense systems, 38 trucks and various other vehicles, all in less than 90 minutes of actual combat. American losses? 0 tanks. Not a single M1A1 knocked out. A few took hits from Iraqi fire. Those 125mm guns could theoretically penetrate Abrams armor if they hit the right spot at the right angle. But theoretical doesn't matter when you're shooting blind and the other guy is putting precisely aimed rounds into your tank from ranges you can't even see at. The kill ratios were so lopsided that if you presented them in a video game, players would complain the game was unrealistic. 61-0 in tank kills alone. That's not a battle. That's target practice with targets that occasionally shoot back but miss. Other units from the 1st Armored Division were hitting the Medina Division simultaneously along different axes of advance. The 1st Brigade engaged Iraqi positions to the east. The 3rd Brigade swept through from another direction. Every American unit had the same advantage. Thermal sights working perfectly through the sandstorm while Iraqi forces stumbled around blind. The cumulative effect was total destruction of the Medina Division as a coherent fighting force. By the time the sun set on February 27th, the Republican Guard's most forward division had essentially ceased to exist. Over 186 T-72 tanks confirmed destroyed across the entire engagement area. Hundreds of other vehicles. Thousands of casualties. American forces had proven something that military theorists had suspected but never demonstrated at this scale. Technology advantage in modern warfare isn't just an edge, it's the entire game. The Iraqis weren't cowards. They weren't incompetent. They were fighting with equipment that was fundamentally obsolete against an enemy a full generation ahead in capability. Some Iraqi units fought to the end. Crews stayed with their tanks even as American rounds systematically destroyed every vehicle in their platoon. That takes guts. It just doesn't matter when courage is irrelevant to the outcome. You can be the bravest tank crew in the world, but bravery doesn't make your optical sights work through a sandstorm. The Americans hadn't even used their full arsenal. They didn't need air support for this engagement. Didn't need artillery preparation, didn't need infantry assaults, just tanks engaging other tanks with superior technology and superior training. And that was enough to produce a massacre. By nightfall, reconnaissance elements were reporting fields of burning Iraqi vehicles stretching for miles. The thermal sights that had been so effective during the sandstorm were now showing hundreds of hot spots, destroyed tanks and vehicles still burning hours after being hit. The entire battlefield lit up on thermal screens like a map of hell. The Medina Division's commander probably sent situation reports back to Baghdad, trying to explain what had happened. I wonder what he said. How do you report that your elite armored division got annihilated by an enemy you never actually saw? How do you explain to Saddam Hussein that thermal imaging technology had made your entire defensive strategy irrelevant before the battle started? The Americans pushed through the destroyed Iraqi positions and kept advancing. There were other Republican Guard divisions to destroy, other missions to accomplish. Medina Ridge was just one engagement in a 4-day ground war. But it was the engagement that proved modern American armor was untouchable. When the sandstorm finally cleared that evening, American reconnaissance units moved through the battlefield to assess the damage. What they found was total annihilation spread across miles of desert. The Medina division had been destroyed. Not damaged, not degraded, destroyed. Conservative estimates put Iraqi tank losses at over 186 T-72s across the entire Medina Ridge engagement area. Some estimates went higher. Hundreds of other armored vehicles, trucks, artillery pieces, air defense systems. The division had effectively ceased to exist as a military unit. Meanwhile, all 348 American Abrams tanks that participated in the battle were still operational. Every single one. Some had taken hits. You can't have a tank battle without somebody getting shot at. But the M1A1's composite armor had shrugged off everything the Iraqis threw at it. A few tanks had minor damage requiring repair. None were knocked out. None were destroyed. That's a kill ratio that shouldn't exist in modern warfare between peer militaries. But Iraq wasn't a peer. They thought they were, which makes this even more brutal. The Republican Guard genuinely believed they were elite armored troops with competitive equipment. They positioned themselves for a decisive battle that would bloody the Americans and prove Iraqi military capability. Instead, they got obliterated without ever seeing the enemy. The destroyed Iraqi tanks told a story. Most showed penetration hits on the turret front or glacis plate. Textbook shot placement from American gunners who had all the time in the world to aim precisely. Many T-72s had their turrets blown completely off from ammunition cook-offs. Some showed multiple hits, suggesting they'd been engaged by several American tanks, or that gunners had put additional rounds into them to ensure the kill. The spacing of the destroyed vehicles revealed how the Iraqis had been positioned. They'd set up in defensive formations with good fields of fire and mutual support, exactly how Soviet doctrine taught them to fight. They'd done everything tactically correct for the equipment they had. It just didn't matter. American doctrine called this overmatch, bringing such overwhelming capability that the enemy can't compete regardless of their actions. Medina Ridge was overmatch demonstrated at its most extreme. The thermal sight advantage was so decisive that nothing else about the battle mattered. Iraqi tactics, courage, defensive positions, numerical strength, all irrelevant when they couldn't see to shoot. The few Iraqi survivors who were captured told interrogators they had no idea what had hit them. They described American tanks appearing out of nowhere after the battle was already over, rolling past burning Iraqi vehicles. Some thought they'd been hit by aircraft or artillery until they saw the Abrams tanks and realized they'd been destroyed in a ground engagement they never knew was happening. I've read accounts of tank battles from World War II where crews describe the terror of being outgunned or outarmored. There's something almost honorable about it. You see the threat, you try to fight, you lose. Medina Ridge wasn't like that. This was being deleted from existence by something you couldn't perceive. The psychological impact must have been devastating for any Iraqis who survived. The battle proved what American military planners had been saying since the early 1980s. Thermal imaging had fundamentally changed armored warfare. The side with superior sensors wins before the shooting starts. Range, armor, gun size, all secondary to the ability to see first. The Medina division had walked into a massacre and never even realized it until they were burning. Medina Ridge gets forgotten in the broader narrative of Desert Storm. Most people remember the air campaign, the highway of death, the 100-hour ground war. They don't remember the specific tank battle that proved American armor was a full generation ahead of anything the Soviets had exported to their client states. But military analysts remember. Tank warfare doctrine changed after Medina Ridge. The lesson was brutally simple. Thermal imaging superiority wins tank battles before they start. Doesn't matter if your armor is thicker. Doesn't matter if your gun is bigger. Doesn't matter if your crews are braver. If you can't see the enemy and they can see you, you lose. Every time. The Soviets noticed. They'd been selling T-72s and T-80s to countries around the world, marketing them as world-class main battle tanks competitive with Western armor. Medina Ridge demonstrated that Soviet export tanks were obsolete against American technology. Not close, not competitive, obsolete. The entire Soviet model of armored warfare that had dominated military thinking since 1945 had been made irrelevant by thermal sights and fire control computers. This wasn't just an American victory. This was American technology dominating Soviet technology so thoroughly that the battle became a one-sided massacre. 186 Iraqi tanks destroyed versus 0 American losses. Those numbers should be impossible between two armored forces of comparable size. They happened because the technology gap was insurmountable. The M1A1 Abrams came out of Desert Storm with a combat record that's still unmatched. 0 Abrams tanks destroyed by enemy fire throughout the entire war. Not one. Meanwhile, American Abrams destroyed hundreds of Iraqi tanks, often from ranges the Iraqis couldn't even shoot back from.
July 4th, 1956. The central command bunker of the Moskovsky Okrug PVO, the Moscow Air Defense District. Deep underground, the air was a refrigerated, pressurized mix of ozone, stale tobacco, and the sharp, metallic smell of hot vacuum tubes. This was the nerve center of the most formidable air defense network on Earth, a fortress of concrete and steel guarding the political and spiritual heart of the Soviet Union. General Lieutenant Viktor Poznyakov, a man whose hard features had been carved by the Great Patriotic War, watched the main plotting table. On the massive, backlit map of Western Russia, young women in uniform methodically pushed wooden blocks representing friendly fighter squadrons. The atmosphere was one of quiet, almost bored confidence. The sky was clear. The Americans were celebrating their national holiday. It was a day like any other. The Protivo-Vozdushnaya Oborona, the PVO, was not just a military branch, it was a sacred vow. The Soviet Union had lost 27 million people, a demographic wound so deep it defined the national psyche. The guiding doctrine, burned into the mind of every officer, from Riga to Vladivostok, was Nikogda Snova, never again. A surprise attack from the air was the death knell of a nation, and they had mortgaged their economy to build an impenetrable shield. Their confidence, on this summer morning, was absolute. Their new radar network, the P-20 periscope, could detect threats hundreds of kilometers away, and in the skies above their guardians waited, the MiG-17, a nimble, cannon-armed dogfighter, and its brand-new sibling, the Mikoyan Gurevich MiG-19. The MiG-19, known to its pilots as the Farmer, was a brute, a twin-engined monster of steel and power. It was the first Soviet production aircraft capable of exceeding the speed of sound in level flight. It could climb to 50,000 feet in minutes. It was, they believed, the master of the stratosphere. Nothing could fly higher. Nothing could fly faster. The sky was theirs. A tinny voice crackled from a console speaker. Comrade General, Tracking Station 12 reports a contact, bearing 270, range 400 kilometers. Poznyakov barely looked up. A Svedje, a Turk. No, Comrade General. The voice was hesitant, tight with confusion. The altitude reading. It must be a malfunction. The machine reports, 20,000 meters. The room went quiet. The rhythmic click of the plotter's tools paused. Poznyakov turned, his chair groaning. What did you say? 20,000 meters. 65,600 feet. It was an impossibility. It was a number from a science fiction novel. The MiG-19's absolute service ceiling, straining every rivet, was just under 59,000 feet. A B-47 bomber, the American standard, topped out at 45,000. The new B-52 seconds, the bogeyman of Soviet nightmares, couldn't get close to 60. "It is a malfunction," Pozniakov stated, his voice flat. "Tell the station to recalibrate their set." "Comrade General," the voice was back, now laced with panic. "Station 14 now has it. And Station 9, it is heading for Moscow." The general strode to the radar repeater screen. A single, slow-moving green blip was crawling across the dark void. It moved with a serene, unhurried pace, not the desperate dash of a fighter, but it was high. Impossibly, apocalyptically high. The numbers flashing next to the target symbol confirmed the altitude, 20,000 meters. "Scramble," Pozniakov's voice was a low growl. "Scramble everything. I want MiGs in the air now. All sectors." Within minutes, the air was torn apart by the sound of afterburners. From Kubinka Air Base, pilots sprinted to their aircraft, pulling on helmets, their minds racing. The order was nonsensical: Angels 65+. They climbed, pushing their engines to the red line. They burned through their fuel in a desperate vertical race. Major Ivan Belenko, leading the first pair of MiG-19 seconds, clawed his way past 50,000 feet. The air was thin, the sky turning a deep, dark purple. His aircraft, a machine of raw power, was shuddering, its controls turning to slush. It was fighting him, starved of air. Ground control was screaming vectors in his ear. He was directly underneath the target. He strained his eyes, looking up through the top of his canopy into the blinding, unfiltered Sunday. And then he saw it. It was not an aircraft, not in any sense he understood. It was a silver speck, a tiny, gleaming needle, impossibly high above him, drawing a thin, perfect white contrail across the deep indigo. It seemed to be stationary, a star in the daylight. But he was stalling, his engines threatening to flame out. And it was moving, serenely, away from him. He was a fish, leaping from the water, watching an eagle soar in a realm he could never, ever reach. He had no weapons that could touch it. He was utterly, completely, profoundly helpless. The single blip flew directly over the heart of Moscow. It passed over the Kremlin, over the Tushino airfield where the Soviets were preparing for their annual Aviation Day, a show of air power meant to intimidate the West. The phantom in the sky photographed their newest bombers, their most secret airfields, their most heavily defended city. And then, with the same casual, unhurried grace, it turned west and vanished. The silence in the PVO bunker was deafening. The fortress had been violated. The impenetrable shield had been proven to be an illusion. This was the kind of story we dig into every week. Subscribe to Cold War Impact so you never miss the truth behind the legends. To understand the depth of the shock that ripped through the Kremlin that day, one must first understand the worldview of the men who ruled it. Nikita Khrushchev and the Soviet High Command were men forged in a crucible of paranoia and justifiable fear. The Second World War was not a distant memory. It was a raw, gaping wound. Their doctrine was built on a foundation of massive, overwhelming industrial and military might. They built tanks by the tens of thousands. They built an air defense network that dwarfed any other on Earth. They believed in numbers, in steel, in brute force. Their intelligence, filtered through the vast networks of the KGB, consistently warned of an aggressive, technologically superior America, a nation capable of launching a nuclear Pearl Harbor at any moment. The Soviets were terrified of a surprise attack. Their entire strategy depended on knowing what the Americans were planning, and above all, hiding their own strengths and weaknesses. The Iron Curtain was not just a political barrier, it was a physical shield to blind the West. They had built their wall of radars and fighters to defeat a known threat, the high-speed, high-altitude jet bomber. The PVO had practiced, over and over, intercepting formations of American B-47 seconds and B-52 seconds. They had charts, tables, and procedures for exactly this. They had proven, they thought, that their system worked. The MiG-19 was their guarantee. The idea that the Americans could, or would, build an aircraft that simply ignored this entire system that flew above it was not something they had ever conceived. It was a failure not just of technology, but of imagination. On the other side of the world, in the sun-baked, desolate expanse of the Nevada desert, A different kind of reality was being forged in total secrecy. The American Central Intelligence Agency, under its director Allen Dulles and President Dwight D.W. Eisenhower, had the opposite problem. They weren't afraid of a surprise attack they couldn't stop. They were afraid of a surprise attack they couldn't see coming. In the mid-1950s, the bomber gap dominated American strategic thinking. The fear was that the Soviets were building a massive, intercontinental fleet of heavy bombers that could overwhelm American air defenses. Was it true? Or was it a bluff? They had no way of knowing. The Iron Curtain was brutally effective. Agents on the ground were almost impossible to run. The borders were sealed. The only way to get the truth was to go over the top. President Eisenhower had proposed open skies, a treaty allowing mutual aerial reconnaissance. Khrushchev had laughed in his face, dismissing it as a transparent ploy for espionage. Thwarted, Eisenhower turned to the one place that specialized in making the impossible possible. Lockheed's Advanced Development Projects Unit, better known as the Skunk Works, run by the notoriously brilliant and demanding chief engineer, Clarence Kelly Johnson. The directive was simple in its audacity. The existing reconnaissance planes, like the RB-47, were just modified bombers. They were fast, but the MiG-19 seconds could catch them. They were high, but the MiGs could reach them. The new plane had to be different. It had to be, for all intents and purposes, invincible. Johnson's solution was not to build a faster, more powerful fighter. It was to build something that defied categorization. Code-named Aquatone, the aircraft was designated the U-2. It was a machine of radical, almost absurd design. It was, in essence, a high-performance glider with a single, powerful J-57 jet engine strapped to its back. Its wings were incredibly long and thin, spanning over 80 feet, giving it a phenomenal lift-to-glide ratio. This allowed it to sip fuel and stay aloft for hours. But its true weapon was its alien operating environment. The U-2 was designed to fly at 70,000 feet 13 miles high. At this altitude, the air is so thin that water boils at room temperature. The sky is a deep, dark violet, and the curvature of the Earth is plainly visible. It was a realm that, until then, had belonged only to experimental rocket planes. Everything about the U-2 was a compromise in service of altitude. It was built of lightweight, fragile materials. It had no weapons. It had no radar. The pilot, wearing what was essentially a full-body spacesuit, had to fly the aircraft manually for the entire 9-hour mission. The plane was notoriously difficult to handle. Its coffin corner was infamous. The margin between the speed at which it would stall in the thin air and the speed at which it would rip itself apart was sometimes less than 10 knots. This was not a warplane. It was a scalpel. It was a delicate, hyper-advanced instrument of intelligence, designed with one unspoken purpose: to render the entirety of the Soviet Union's massive air defense fortress obsolete. It was a machine designed to fly above the war, to treat the most heavily defended airspace on the planet as if it simply did not exist. Back in the Moscow bunker, General Podznyakov stared at the empty map. The contrail, the silver speck, had been seen by dozens of pilots. The radar stations had all filed identical, impossible reports. The humiliation was total. The Americans had not just flown over his city, they had done it with contempt. They had proven, on their own Independence Day, that the Soviet shield was a lie. The ghost had walked through the wall, and the fortress, built at such staggering cost, was worthless. The immediate aftermath in the Moscow PVO bunker was not frantic panic. It was a cold, stunned silence, a paralysis of disbelief. General Podznyakov and his officers were military men, professionals who believed in the immutable laws of physics and aerodynamics. Their machines, their training, and their entire careers were built on a foundation of known quantities. The event that had just transpired, the effortless violation of their capital, did not fit their reality. It was a system error, a tear in the fabric of their world. The first reports, handwritten and stamped Osobey Papka special folder, for the eyes of the High Command only, were a tangle of confused, contradictory, and terrified eyewitness accounts. Pilots reported a silver disc. Radar operators claimed the target disappeared and reappeared. Some ground observers, catching a glint of the high-altitude contrail in the evening sun, even reported a comet. The The system had been so overwhelmed by the impossible data that it had broken down, not just mechanically, in its inability to track and intercept, but psychologically. In the Kremlin, the report landed on Nikita Khrushchev's desk like a grenade. The Soviet premier, a man of volatile, earthy passions, exploded. He was not a fool. He knew exactly who was responsible and what it meant. He had just publicly declared that the Soviet Union was turning out missiles like sausages, boasting of a technological prowess that would soon bury the West. Now, the Americans had made him a liar in his own backyard. He railed at his generals, at his intelligence chiefs, at the designers at the Mikoyan Gurevich Bureau. "Find it," he bellowed, "and shoot it down." The order was absolute. The entire weight of the Soviet state was mobilized to hunt the Phantom. The PVO was put on permanent high alert. Elite fighter wings were moved to key Western air bases. The new S-25 Berkut surface-to-air missile system, a massive, complex, and ruinously expensive fixed-site defense ringing Moscow, was brought to full readiness, its crews sleeping in their bunkers. The KGB's first chief directorate, responsible for foreign intelligence, was tasked with a single, overriding priority: discover the secret of the American ghost plane. They had no idea what they were hunting. The KGB's initial analysis, based on the fragmentary radar data, was that it was an unmanned drone or a high-altitude balloon. The idea that it was a manned aircraft, that an American pilot had been at the controls, was dismissed as sheer fantasy. No human could survive at that altitude. No engine could breathe that air. While the Soviet war machine re-engineered itself to fight a ghost, the ghost was preparing to fly again. At a CIA operating base in Wiesbaden, West Germany, the pilots of Detachment A were debriefing. The pilot of the Moscow mission, Hervey Stockman, was clinically precise. He handed over the canisters of film, miles of high-resolution images that would be developed and rushed by courier to Washington. The mood was not one of celebration. It was the quiet, focused satisfaction of professionals. The man in charge, Richard Bissell, the CIA's visionary for technical operations, was already planning the next phase. The Moscow flight was not just a stunt, it was a proof of concept. It had confirmed that the U-2 could go anywhere. Now, the real work would begin. The primary target was the one place the West was blind: the vast, secret industrial complexes deep in the heart of Russia. The intelligence community was desperate to find the Tyuratam missile test range and the elusive Atomgrads, the closed cities where the Soviet nuclear weapons program lived. On July 9th, 1956, just 5 days after the Moscow shock, a U-2 piloted by Carmine Vito lifted off from Wiesbaden. His targets were the Soviet submarine yards at Leningrad and the naval bases of the Baltic Fleet. The PVO was waiting. This time, they were not just confused, they were furious. The moment the U-2's blip appeared on their screens, the sky erupted. Dozens of MiG-19 seconds were scrambled. From air bases around Leningrad, pilots sprinted to their jets, a cold dread mixing with their adrenaline. They knew the orders were futile. They climbed, their engines screaming, into the purple-black stratosphere. They were stacked by ground control, sent to different altitudes, 50,000, 52, 55, in a desperate attempt to form a wall of steel that the intruder would have to fly through. The pilot's radio chatter, monitored by American signals intelligence, was a symphony of desperation. "I see him. I see the contrail. He is Bog, Znal, God knows. 10,000 meters above me. Ground. I am at maximum altitude. My controls are gone. I am stalling. Fire. Fire a missile. Why are the missiles not firing?" On the ground, the crews of the S-25 missile batteries watched their own radar screens with equal horror. Their powerful, yo-yo, tracking radars had a lock, but the system's computers, programmed to calculate the intercept trajectory for a fast-moving but low target like a B-52, could not solve the physics problem. The U-2 was so high that by the time the lumbering, telephone pole-sized V-300 missile could reach that altitude, the target was already dozens of miles away. It was like trying to hit a hawk with a catapult. They were firing at a ghost. Carmine Vito, sealed inside his pressurized helmet, was calm. He was a test pilot, trained to be a human sensor. His job was to manage his fuel, keep his delicate aircraft inside its coffin corner, and ensure the cameras were rolling. Far below him, he could see the contrails of the MiG interceptors, tiny white scratches against the blue and white marble of the earth. They looked like futile, angry gestures, insects trying to swat a satellite. He saw their missiles, arcing up, gleaming in the sun as they climbed, only to lose energy and fall harmlessly back to Earth, miles below his wings. He wasn't just observing them, he was cataloguing them. His mission was not just photography, it was electronic intelligence. The U-2 was a ferret, its belly bristling with antennas designed to listen. As the Soviets scrambled their fighters and activated their missile radars, they were screaming their secrets into the sky. The U-2 recorded the exact frequencies of their ground control intercept radios. It mapped the precise locations and signal types of their Fansong and Yo-Yo radars. It identified the electronic signature of their entire air defense network. The Soviets, in their frantic, desperate attempt to shoot down the intruder, were handing the CIA the keys to their kingdom. They were unwittingly providing the United States with a complete electronic map of their most secret defenses. Every missile they fired, every fighter they scrambled, only made the Americans stronger. The psychological impact on the PVO was catastrophic. The Leningrad mission was followed by another and another. Each time, the same result: utter, humiliating failure. The pilots, the Falcons of the motherland, were being asked to do the impossible, to fight a war in an element their machines could not reach. They would land, their fuel exhausted, their bodies shaking from the strain of pushing their aircraft to their breaking points. Morale plummeted. They were the best pilots in the Soviet Union, flying the most advanced interceptors, and they were being treated with contempt. This was not warfare. It was a mockery. The Americans weren't just spying. They were rubbing the Soviet Union's face in its own technological backwardness. The single, untouchable aircraft was a message, delivered with brutal clarity. Your fortress is an illusion. Your best weapons are toys. Your skies, the sacred airspace of the motherland, are ours to command. The political fallout was immediate. Khrushchev was apoplectic. He knew he was being strategically undressed. The Americans, with their photographs, would soon know the truth. The bomber gap was a myth. The sausage factory for missiles was a Potemkin village. The Soviet Union's mighty nuclear deterrent, the foundation of its superpower status, was largely a bluff. The U-2 was not just an intelligence plane. It was a political weapon that was dismantling the Soviet Union's entire global strategy. But the humiliation was also deeply personal for the men on the front lines. The PVO, a branch of the military that enjoyed immense prestige, was becoming a laughingstock. The reports they had to file up the chain of command were a litany of failure. Target tracked. Altitude 21,000 meters. Interceptors scrambled, failed to engage. Ammunition expended. 0. Fuel expended? 80,000 kilograms. In the West, the intelligence was a revelation. The high-resolution photographs from the U-2 missions were unlike anything the CIA had ever seen. They were not blurry, indistinct shapes. They were crystal clear. Analysts in Washington could count the individual bogies on a T-54 tank. They could differentiate between a real bomber and a wooden decoy. And, in July 1957, they found what they were looking for. A U-2 mission over Kazakhstan brought back the first images of the Turatam test range. The analysts saw it, the massive, cross-shaped launch complex for a rocket of unbelievable size. This was the R-7, the world's first intercontinental ballistic missile, ICBM. The discovery was a profound shock, but it was a known quantity. The fear of the unknown was replaced by the cold, hard calculus of a missile gap. The U-2 had given the Americans the one thing they needed most: time. But it had also confirmed that the clock was ticking. For the Soviets, the humiliation continued. For 4 years, from 1,956 to 1,960, the U-2 seconds flew with impunity. They flew over the submarine pens at Murmansk. They photographed the nuclear test sites at Semipalatinsk. They mapped the uranium processing plants in Siberia. With every mission, the PVO threw up its desperate, futile defense. With every mission, they failed. The Phantom was no longer a mystery. It was a recurring, unbearable symbol of their impotence. The sleek, silent aircraft became a ghost in their machine, a psychological weapon that was slowly breaking the spirit of the Soviet military. The vow of never again had become a bitter joke. It was happening again every few weeks, in broad daylight. The high-altitude Phantom, the Silver Needle, was not just an aircraft, it was a judgment. The initial shock of 1,000 956 did not fade. It calcified. The frantic, failed scrambles over Moscow and Leningrad were not isolated incidents, they were the brutal opening chapter of a new, systematic, and relentless form of warfare. The U-2 flights, operating under the CIA codename Operation Overflight, transformed from a daring gamble into a routine, meteorological and psychological dissection of the entire Soviet Empire. The Phantom had become a system. The program's headquarters at Wiesbaden, West Germany, and later at Adana, Turkey, and Peshawar, Pakistan, became the nerve centers for this new campaign. The missions were no longer just about daring penetrations, they were about methodical, comprehensive mapping. The CIA, working with the National Photographic Interpretation Center, had created a shopping list of the Soviet Union's most vital secrets. At the top of that list were the two pillars of Soviet power, their nuclear weapons program and their new, terrifying ICBMs. For the PVO, this new reality was a grim, humiliating ritual. The blip would appear on their radar screens, a tiny, slow-moving symbol of their own impotence. The altitude reading, once a source of confusion, was now a familiar harbinger of failure. 20,000 meters, 21,000, sometimes 22,000. The orders would come down from high command, devoid of hope, choked with bureaucratic rage. Scramble all fighters, engage and destroy. The pilots, sitting in their cockpits on Alert 5 status, would sigh, strap on their helmets, and rocket into the sky on another fool's errand. They knew, with absolute certainty, that they would fail. They were actors in a mandatory, expensive, and deeply demoralizing piece of state theater. A prime example was the hunt for Tyuratam. By 1957, American intelligence was obsessed with the R-7 missile program. They knew it existed, but they had no idea where. A U-2 flight in August 1957, launching from Pakistan, was given the grid coordinates. The pilot, flying a long, lonely track over the barren steppes of Kazakhstan, found it. For the Soviet commanders on the ground at Tyuratam, the most secret location in their entire nation, the moment was surreal. This was their holy of holies, the birthplace of their nuclear shield. It was defended by its own elite PVO regiment. And as they watched their radars, the American ghost plane sailed serenely overhead, its high-resolution cameras methodically scanning every launch pad, every assembly building, every rail line. They scrambled their local interceptors. The pilots climbed, pushed their engines, and watched the Silver Needle draw a perfect line across their sky, far, far above them. They were guarding the most important secret in the world, and they were as helpless as if they were shaking their fists at the moon. When that film was processed in Washington, the analysts at NPIC stared in stunned silence. There it was, the massive, cross-shaped launch complex, the R-7 itself, visible on the pad. The missile gap was real. But now, it was a known quantity. The system was working. This systematic failure gave birth to a haunting, recurring symbol. It was not a sound. The U-2 was too high and too slow to create a sonic boom. It was a visual, an image that burned itself into the minds of a generation of Soviet pilots and soldiers. It was the contrail. At 70,000 feet, the U-2 disturbed a layer of the atmosphere so cold and stable that its exhaust condensed into a pencil-thin, brilliant white contrail of ice crystals. In the deep indigo black of the stratosphere, against the blinding sun, this contrail would hang in the air for hours, a shimmering, unnatural scar. To the MiG-19 pilot, straining his aircraft to its breaking point at 55,000 feet, this contrail was a personal insult. It was a tangible line, drawn just above his reach, a chalk mark on a blackboard he could not touch. He would fly towards it, his jet shuddering on the edge of a stall, and see the tiny silver speck at its tip, pulling away from him with the slow, inevitable arrogance of a god. He would return to base, shaking with frustration, having to file another report of failure, all while the evidence of his impotence, the white line, was still visible to everyone on the ground. For the radar operator in his bunker, it was a torment. His screen showed a target he could not hand off to his missile batteries. He would track it, make his reports, and listen to the useless, angry chatter of the pilots. The blip was a recurring nightmare, a weekly reminder that the enemy was technologically superior. And for the ordinary Soviet citizen in cities like Kiev or Leningrad, it was a source of baffling, terrifying rumor. On a clear day, they would look up and see it. A star moving in broad daylight. It was too high to be a normal plane, too slow to be a meteor. It was a silent, ominous presence. The official state propaganda, the posters of heroic PVO crews and invincible missiles, claimed the skies were secure. But the lie was visible, written across the sky for all to see. The contrail was the psychological weapon. It was the calling card of the phantom. It was the visible proof that the Iron Curtain, the great symbol of Soviet isolation and power, was a fiction. The Americans could part it at will. This relentless, systematic pressure forced the Soviets to become more desperate. The PVO developed new, frantic tactics. They began attempting snap-up attacks. MiG-19 seconds, and later the newer, faster Sukhoi Su-9, would be vectored by ground control to a point not at the U-2, but in front of it. The pilots would then perform a zoom climb, pulling the jet into a near-vertical ascent, trading all their speed for a few thousand feet of altitude. Imagine the pilot, his body crushed by G-forces, his engines screaming, his aircraft shuddering, clawing its way to 60,000, 65,000 feet. He would be completely blind, flying on instruments, and the desperate voice of his controller. At the apex of his climb, on the verge of a stall, he would have a few seconds to try and find the target, to point his nose at the silver speck and unleash a salvo of unguided rockets, praying for a 1-in-a-million hit. Then his energy bled off, his fighter would stall, the engines would flame out in the thin air, and he would fall, tumbling thousands of feet back to Earth, frantically trying to restart his engines. It was a suicidal medieval tactic, like a knight charging a machine gun. And it never, ever worked. The U-2 pilots in their pressurized cockpits would occasionally see them, the brief, distant flash of a rocket salvo, arcing harmlessly, miles below and miles behind. They were ghosts, firing at a phantom. This was the new normal. From 1956 to 1960, the U-2 conducted over 20 successful deep penetration flights. The program systematically mapped the entire Western and Southern Soviet Union. It found the bomber bases. It found the missile sites. It found the nuclear plants. It proved, conclusively, that the Soviet military, for all its terrifying size, was a hollow giant, technologically a decade behind the West. But the system, and its haunting symbol, had also created a wound in the Soviet psyche. It was a wound of humiliation, a deep, festering anger that went all the way to the top. Khrushchev, slammed on the world stage by the U-2's revelations, was a man obsessed. He had given his engineers a blank check. He had told them to build a missile that could reach the heavens. He was no longer just trying to stop an intelligence threat. He was trying to kill a symbol. He was hunting the white contrail. The persistent, ghostly intrusions of the U-2 were no longer a military secret. They were a festering political wound. The reports landing on Nikita Khrushchev's desk in the Kremlin detailed not just the failures of his PVO, but the precise locations of his most secret bomber bases, his submarine pens, and his fledgling missile silos. The Americans were not just spying, they were compiling a target list. Khrushchev, a man who staked his entire political reputation on Soviet strength, was being exposed as a fraud. He had boasted to the world that his air defenses could hit a fly in the sky. The U-2 was making him a global laughingstock. His generals, men like Marshal of the Soviet Union Sergei Biryuzov, commander of the PVO, were in a state of quiet panic. They were technologically outmatched, and they knew it. In 1958, in a series of furious, closed-door meetings, the order was given. This was not a request for a new fighter. It was a demand for a revolution. The problem was not just altitude. It was the entire Soviet air defense philosophy. It was failing. The Kremlin turned to the brilliant, mercurial engineer Pyotr Grushin at the Lavochkin Design Bureau. The directive was unequivocal. Build a weapon that can kill the American Phantom. Price was no object. Failure was not an option. The result was the S-75 Divina, known to NATO as the SA-2 guideline. This was not just another missile. It was a purpose-built U-2 killer. It was a two-stage, solid-fuel rocket, more than 30 feet long. It was guided by a powerful new ground control radar, the RSN-75, codenamed Fansong by NATO. This radar was not a simple searchlight. It was a sophisticated tracking and engagement system that operated on multiple frequencies, designed to lock on to a high-altitude target and guide the V-750 missile all the way to intercept. The missile itself was a brute. Its rocket motor could propel it to over Mach 3, pushing its 430-pound high-explosive warhead to an altitude of 80,000 feet. This was its key. It was designed to fly to the U-2's realm, not just chase it from below. Its warhead was equipped with a proximity fuse, meaning it didn't need a direct hit, it just had to get close. The resulting blast fragmentation pattern would shred a fragile, lightweight airframe like the U-2. By 1959, the new S-75 batteries were being deployed in a ring around Moscow and, more importantly, in secret, heavily camouflaged sites near the Soviet Union's most sensitive targets, Tyuratam, the Kapustin Yar test range, and the new nuclear weapons city of Tomsk-7. The CIA knew this. Their own electronic ferret missions had begun to pick up the new strange signals of the fan-song radars. The U-2 pilots were warned. The game was changing. But American confidence, born of 4 years of untouchable success, had hardened into arrogance. They believed the U-2 could fly high enough, and their pilots were skilled enough to simply skirt the edges of the new missile's engagement envelope. They were wrong. The Soviets, for their part, were learning. They were no longer the frantic, disorganized mob of 1956. They were becoming patient, methodical hunters. They studied the U-2's routes. They saw the patterns. The Americans liked to fly on clear days for better photographs. They often used the same entry and exit corridors. The PVO began to lay a trap, not with one battery, but with dozens. They moved S-75 battalions into position along the U-2's most predictable flight path, creating a flak trap in the stratosphere. May 1st, 1960, May Day, the most important holiday on the Soviet calendar, a day of massive military parades in Red Square, a celebration of communist power. From an airfield in Peshawar, Pakistan, a CIA pilot named Francis Gary Powers lifted off in his U-2C. His mission, codenamed Grand Slam, was one of the longest and most audacious ever planned. He was to fly 3,800 miles across the entire breadth of the Soviet Union, photographing the missile complex at Tyuratam, the industrial city of Sverdlovsk, and the new ICBM test site at Plesetsk, before landing at Bodø, Norway. As Powers crossed the border at 65,000 feet, the Soviet air defense network lit up. This time there was no confusion. They had been tracking him for 30 minutes before he even entered their airspace, their long-range P-35 radars watching his every move. In the central PVO command bunker, Marshal Biryuzov himself was overseeing the operation. For the first 2 hours of the flight, he held his fire. He let Powers fly deep, deep into the trap. He let him fly over Tyuratam, his cameras humming, his confidence building. He let him get comfortable, believing this was just another routine milk run. Then, as Powers approached Sverdlovsk, Biryuzov gave the order, "Destroy the target at all costs." In his cockpit, Powers was listening to his headphones, his electronic warfare gear scanning for threats. Suddenly, the system didn't just chirp a warning, it screamed. His cockpit lit up with warning lights. It wasn't one fan-song radar. It was dozens, all locking onto him simultaneously. He was in the center of the kill box. He had no time to react. On the ground, Major Mikhail Voronov, commander of an S-75 battery, had a perfect lock. Target. In range. Fire 1. A V-750 missile leaped from its launcher, a streak of white fire climbing at 3 times the speed of sound. Within seconds, it reached 70,000 feet. Powers saw a brilliant orange flash. His aircraft was not hit. The missile had exploded behind him, but it was close enough. The fragile U-2 was hammered by the shockwave and a hail of shrapnel. The long, delicate tail section was shredded. The wings cracked. The aircraft, mortally wounded, snapped into an inverted, flat spin. Powers was thrown against his canopy, pinned by G-forces, his unpressurized suit inflating. The invincible Phantom was falling, tumbling uncontrollably back to Earth. The Soviets, in their bloodlust, were taking no chances. A total of 14 S-75 missiles were fired by multiple batteries. The sky was filled with explosions. In the chaos, a pair of MiG-19 seconds, scrambled in a futile, low-level chase, flew directly into the missile barrage. One of them, piloted by Senior Lieutenant Sergei Safronov, was hit by one of his own side's missiles. He was killed instantly. The Soviets had shot down one of their own fighters in their desperate, frantic effort to kill the U-2. Francis Gary Powers, struggling in his spinning cockpit, managed to jettison the canopy and bail out. He drifted down under his parachute, landing in a field where he was immediately captured by bewildered farmers. The ghost was in custody. The killer statistic was not the number of missiles fired. It was the result: 1 U-2 downed, 1 pilot captured. The veil of invincibility was not just torn, it was ripped to shreds and put on public display. The psychological toll this time was not Soviet, it was American. In Washington, President Eisenhower, believing the pilot was dead and the plane destroyed, initiated the weather flight cover story. It was a catastrophic blunder. In Moscow, Khrushchev had the ultimate prize. He waited. He let Eisenhower lie to the world press. Then, on May 7th, he sprang his trap. In a dramatic speech to the Supreme Soviet, he revealed the truth. "Comrades, I must tell you a secret. We have parts of the plane, and we have the pilot." The captured pilot, Francis Gary Powers. The wreckage of the U-2, laid out for the world to see in Gorky Park. The high-resolution photographs of his own secret bases, developed from the recovered film. The political humiliation was total. The Paris Peace Summit, scheduled for just days later, collapsed in spectacular fashion. Eisenhower's presidency was permanently scarred. The U-2 overflight stopped. They never flew over the Soviet Union again. The S-75 Divina, the purpose-built counter, the desperate, expensive bet, had worked. It had not just shot down an aircraft, it had shot down an entire pillar of American foreign policy. The psychological unraveling was now happening in the White House. The Soviets had proven, with one violent, perfectly executed ambush, that the Phantom could bleed, and in doing so, they had changed the entire strategic balance of the Cold War. The trial of Francis Gary Powers was a global spectacle. For 10 days in August 1960, the Hall of Columns in Moscow's House of Unions became the stage for the Soviet Union's greatest propaganda victory. It was a show trial, but one where the evidence was undeniable. Powers, pale and bewildered in a dark civilian suit, sat in a wooden dock, facing a panel of 3 impassive military judges. He confessed. He had to. The wreckage of his aircraft was on public display in Gorky Park, a mangled trophy of silver and orange. The high-resolution photographs he had taken of their own missile bases were enlarged for the world's press to see. Nikita Khrushchev was at the absolute zenith of his power. He had done the impossible. He had swatted the American fly from the sky. He had captured the pilot. He had exposed Eisenhower in a global lie, shattering the Paris Peace Summit and humiliating the President of the United States on the world stage. The PVO, once a source of national shame, was lionized. Marshal Biryuzov and the men of the S-75 batteries were heroes of the Soviet Union. The message, blasted from Radio Moscow in every language, was clear. The skies of the motherland were inviolable. The technological arrogance of the West had been met and defeated by the superior power of Soviet engineering. The S-75 missile, the countermeasure born of 4 years of humiliation, was a colossal success. It was a perfect product of the Soviet system. A centralized, state-funded, brute force solution to a specific, defined problem. They had identified a threat, and they had forged a hammer to smash it. In this, they were victorious. The U-2 overflight stopped, instantly and permanently. The American Phantom was grounded. In Washington, the mood was funereal. The political fallout was a disaster, but the strategic crisis was far worse. The U-2 had been their only reliable window into the Soviet Union. Now in 1960, at the precise moment the missile gap was the most terrifying question in the world, they were blind. The Iron Curtain had slammed shut. The loss of Powers' aircraft wasn't just the loss of a plane, it was the loss of invulnerability. It proved the Soviets could now touch them at the highest ceilings of the atmosphere. President Eisenhower, in the final bitter months of his presidency, was horrified. He had staked his strategy on this eyes in the sky, and it had failed. The CIA's Richard Bissell, the U-2's architect, saw his grand program collapse. But this is the fundamental, defining difference between the two systems. The Soviet Union celebrated its victory. It had built a wall, and the wall had worked. They doubled down on the S-75, mass-producing it, shipping it to client states like North Vietnam and Cuba, confident that they had solved the problem of high-altitude reconnaissance. They had won the current battle. The United States, in the agony of its defeat, immediately began to win the next war. The verdict of this contest was not delivered in the Hall of Columns in Moscow. It was delivered in the sun-drenched, desolate expanse of the Nevada desert at the secret test site known as Groom Lake. Even before Powers was shot down, the CIA and Lockheed's Skunk Works knew the U-2's days were numbered. The S-75 fan-song radars were a clear warning. The Mayday incident was not a surprise, it was a catalyst. The American response to the S-75 was not to build a better missile shield, it was not to find a brute force counter. It was to make the S-75 and the entire Soviet air defense network obsolete. It was to build a machine that operated so far outside the enemy's reality that they would be left, once again, baffled and helpless. While Khrushchev was parading the U-2's wreckage, Kelly Johnson and his team at the Skunk Works were already building the prototype of its successor. The project was codenamed Oxcart. The result was the A-12, the precursor to its more famous sibling, the SR-71 Blackbird. This was the true systemic and ideological response. The Soviet Union had built a 30-foot Mark III missile to kill a fragile subsonic aircraft. The United States responded by building a manned aircraft that could fly faster and higher than the missile built to kill it. The A-12 was not an airplane, it was a spaceship. It was built from a metal, titanium, that the Soviets themselves had to be tricked into selling to the CIA through shell companies. It flew at Mach 3.3 over 2,200 miles per hour at an altitude of over 85,000 feet. The challenges were so monumental that every single component had to be invented from scratch. The J-58 hybrid engines, the JP-7 fuel, the quartz glass cockpit, the pilot's full-pressure spacesuits. This is where the Soviet system, for all its triumphant pride in 1960, hit a wall it could not climb. The S-75 was a brilliant piece of reactionary engineering. The A-12 was a product of revolutionary innovation. The command economy, with its 5-year plans and its fear of failure, could not compete with a system that gave a handful of brilliant minds the freedom and the resources to pursue the impossible. When the Blackbird began its own operational flights years later, the Soviets were thrown back into a state of stunned disbelief, a humiliation far deeper than the U-2 had ever inflicted. They scrambled their new Mi-G 21 seconds and Su-15 seconds. They were left miles below, gasping in the stratosphere. They threw their entire national treasure into building a counter, the Mikoyan Gurevich MiG-25 Foxbat. It was a monster of steel, powered by 2 of the largest jet engines ever created. On paper, it could match the Blackbird's speed, but it was a lie. It was a product of the same flawed brute force philosophy. It could only reach Mach 3 for a few minutes before its engines destroyed themselves. The Blackbird, by contrast, sipped fuel at Mach 3.2, its engines becoming more efficient the faster it went. The Soviets had been dragged into a technological race they could not win, a race started by the very failure of the U-2. The Blackbird, born from the U-2's ashes, became a recurring, untouchable phantom that psychologically shattered the PVO. Over 1,000 missiles, including the S-75, were fired at it during its operational life. Not a single one ever hit. The ultimate demonstration of this systemic failure came not in the sky but on the ground. The arms race, this relentless technological contest exemplified by the U-2, the S-75, and the Blackbird, became a war of economics. The Soviet Union, in its desperate attempt to keep pace, to build the interceptors and missiles to stop the phantoms the West was inventing, bankrupted itself. Its command economy, so good at building massive, simple things like tanks and hammers, could not sustain the level of high-tech innovation required. It was a system built to imitate, not to invent. On the night of November 9th, 1989, a young East German border guard stood at his post at the Berlin Wall, listening to the roar of a crowd. The wall, like the S-75 missile, was a brute force solution. It was a physical, concrete barrier designed to stop a specific threat. But the system it protected was hollow. It had been economically and psychologically broken, beaten by an ideology that could invent its way out of any problem, that could turn a tactical defeat like the U-2 into a strategic, generational victory. In the final epilogue, the story of the U-2 is not one of American failure. It is the story of a system that confronted its own vulnerability, and instead of building a higher wall, chose to invent a new dimension. The wreckage displayed in Gorky Park in 1960 was not a symbol of Soviet triumph. It was a monument to their last great victory. It was the trophy they won in a battle that, by its very nature, guaranteed they would lose the war. The future did not belong to the men who built the perfect hammer. It belonged to the men who, in response, invented a machine that lived in a world where hammers didn't exist.